Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is the sultry voice of your host today, Kai McAllister, and I am joined by two other distinguished members of the panel who will be joining me in a whimsical journey to the heart of Europe and the creation of what is today the largest and most powerful state in the European Union. So I really don't even need to state what the name of that country is, because every astute listener of this podcast will instantly know the nation to which I make reference. But I'll say it nonetheless in case we have any visitors. Germany. Germany is not as old as many people think. Many people, I've heard it said before that Germany is, they assume that every European state is older than the United States. Not so. Germany was actually came into being in the middle of the 1800s, so the 19th century, and so it's not as old as people think. And its coming into being was very contentious, very hard fought for, very fragile, and ultimately it was achieved by a figure who is well known to history, Otto von Bismarck. But what if it wasn't? That's the topic of today, and I'm not going to explain in detail. I'm going to toss it over to my co-host, but before I do so, I'd like to introduce the other members of the panel, which I realized I should have done prior. Joining me today is none other than His Excellency Evan Buck.
Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
And the other co-host who will be introducing our topic at length, Chris Coppola.
Hi, good people. I mean, yeah, 19th century Europe, you knew I was going to be around somewhere.
Yes, of course. It can't be. You cannot talk about it without Chris.
Can't have an episode about 19th century Europe without Chris Coppola involved.
Chris, take it away.
Like all 19th century Europe, we need to start in 18th century France. I promise. I think on the pre-podcast when I told everyone I was going here, they muted their mics, but I sure felt the collective groan. I'm going to try and keep this moving quickly, though. The
2 hours later.
The two most important things coming out of the French Revolution: liberalism, kind of Republican constitutionalism, and nationalism. And I think those are the two things that are going to kind of be fighting it out in our story. It's kind of the idea of both came together very well in the French Revolution, the Napoleonic ideals, but by 1848, not just in Germany, but in a lot of Europe, you start seeing a peeling off where you have the monarchical. I mean, we are legitimately going to be talking about a king who still believed in the divine right of kings. They start kind of getting the idea that we can harness this idea of nationalism to increase our own power and use it against constitutionalism. And that is a large part of what happens in our timeline. But to kind of fast forward, okay, Napoleon loses. In the settlement of 1815, the Congress of Vienna, you have the creation of basically the German Zollverein, which was kind of a customs union. At this point, one of the things Napoleon did is he merged a ton of German states. I mean, when he came in, you still had many legitimately city-states, cities that were independent countries. You had um, like church lands. You had principalities. There were over 300 countries, 300 independent states in what is today Germany, or what became Germany, because as we were discussing, as most of you probably know, these borders move a couple more times.
Just a wee bit.
Little bit, little bit. Um, at this point, there's 39 countries that compose Germany. They are all joined in a customs union, and that customs union basically allows for free trade amongst them, but that's all it does. It doesn't have any kind of unified tax policy. It doesn't have a national government. It doesn't have a national military. It doesn't have any of this. But over the course of the next 30-ish years, you do have a sense growing of unity amongst the German people. I think one of the big aspects of that, or one of the big moments of that, was the defeat of Napoleon, kind of all of the different states coming together to basically kind of just keep him moving all the way back to Paris. Um, that's basically where we are in 1848. When 1848 begins, it is kind of the year of revolutions throughout Europe. The one nation that doesn't have a revolution is Britain. Just about everyone else does. Louis Philippe is overthrown in France. The Austrian emperor is forced to step down, and actually, that's when you get Franz Joseph, who, for those of you who may not follow along at home too terribly much, yeah, no, that's the exact same Franz Joseph whose nephew was killed in 1914. There is the same Austrian emperor for the next 60, 70 years. You don't have anything in Russia. Russia kind of actually stops a lot of the other revolutions from going any further. And in our timeline, what happens in Germany is there is something called the Frankfurt Parliament, which convenes with those two ideas I talked about, with a constitutional, a liberal wing trying to establish either a republic or some sort of constitutional monarchy, with everything we think of when we think of a liberal constitution: freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, all of these nice things. And also at the same time, trying to unify all of the German speaking people of Europe, because there has never been any problems created at any point in the future when anyone tries to unify all of the German speaking people of Europe. In this timeline, they promulgate a constitution which would largely be very similar to kind of the English Constitution, or the informal English settlement, in that, thinking about the Glorious Revolution, when the Parliament offers the crown to the king, they are the ones that put the king there. And in this timeline, this Parliament offers the crown of Germany to Frederick Wilhelm, the King of Prussia at this point. Frederick Wilhelm IV, I believe.
I think so, yeah.
Yes,
King
it's
of
the
Prussia
fourth.
at this point. He has a young advisor named Otto von Bismarck at this point.
Might have heard of him before.
Might have actually heard of him during my first episode.
Yeah.
Who basically describes this as a crown from the gutter. He says, "You are king by the right of God, and there is no parliament in the world that can offer you this crown." He says, "I agree with you. I will not take this crown." Then proceeds to take the crown by force. In effect, Wilhelm Frederick Wilhelm and his son Wilhelm partner with Otto von Bismarck to, I think Kai put it best that if you're not Bismarck, you can't understand how Bismarck does it. Um, Basically trigger wars with Denmark, Austria, and France that create the sense of an external threat to Germany and force all of the smaller German states to join with Prussia. So that rather than a parliament and kind of a peaceful coming together of Germany, under these circumstances, you have Prussia conquering the other, what we consider the German states. I do say that only because, Austria, kind of other parts. There are German-speaking parts that aren't part of that empire.
Which may or may not be controversial later on, maybe a few decades down the line. Might be in Czechia, perhaps.
But basically unifies Germany by force, and basically Germany becomes a larger version of Prussia. I think, and to kind of understand that, the best quote would be, okay, let's go back to the 18th century. I have to, I'm sorry. Talking about Prussia, most nations have an army. That army has a nation. And the sense of Germany being a very militaristic power, inherited from Prussia, but now unified. And I mean, they have an army and they are not afraid to use it. And all of Europe realizes this, and all of Europe gets very nervous by this new creation right at the heart of their country or at the heart of the continent in 1871. So, is that a good setup?
Yeah, I think that sets us up pretty excellently for talking about the fork, which is rather than Frederick declining this crown offered by the Frankfurt Parliament, we are instead going to have him formally accept and receive this. And it's interesting to me, like, how we are going to go about doing this. And for the interest of full disclosure, sure, some of what we talked about in the pre-podcast, we kind of have a delineation between what we think might be more likely to happen. And that's what we usually talk about with a fork in time, an alternate timeline that is most likely to happen. And we're going to be taking a slight bit of liberty with that formula, and we're going to be talking about what we think is actually, even though it's maybe a little less likely, there's still, precedent and argument to back up this alternate scenario that we're going to be talking about, because we frankly think it's going to be a lot more fun and a lot more interesting. And so, but to me, what I find interesting about this fork is Frederick himself in our timeline was very adamant against, receiving this crown. Like, he was polite to them. He was polite to the Frankfurt envoy when they came to him and knocked at his door. He's like, yeah, you know what? I don't really think I'll do this. Like, thank you guys. I'm pretty honored that you want to give this honor to me, but like, nah, I'm good. Like, you can go back, and I'm not gonna do this because, I believe a little bit differently. But in private letters, he was not very flattering about these people at all. Consider that these, like we kind of set up earlier, these are liberals, these are revolutionaries. There's a lot of socialist, communist leanings in some of these delegates. And so they're not exactly seen as ruler material by old Prussian nobility, to put it nicely. And he wrote in a private letter to his sister Charlotte, which was really intended for her husband. He said, "You have read my reply to the man, donkey, dog, pig, and cat delegation from Frankfurt. It means in simple German, sirs, you have not any right at all to offer me anything whatsoever. Ask, yes, you may ask, but give, no. For in order to give, you would first of all have to be in possession of something that can be given. And this is not the case." And Chris, in the pre-podcast, you mentioned that you might be enlisting the help of a German speaker. to know if that whole man, donkey, dog, pig, and cat delegation line is all one German word, given the fact that the quote website that I looked up has it all together in hyphens. I have a strong hunch and suspicion that it's probably just one German epithet, one very unflattering German word that has been translated into all of those different English words. But how we're going to have this very obstinate king take it in this alternate timeline is we're essentially going to have him believe that the broader goal of German unification and what the Frankfurt Parliament is trying to do is more important than his own anti-democratic tendencies and his own beliefs about the divine right of kings. And so, with all that being set up, what do we think are the immediate implications of Frederick accepting the crown from the gutter?
I think probably the most important thing has nothing to do with the fact that he accepts, and it has everything to do with how the European powers to his east, south, and west, and even north, view his acceptance of this proposition. We got to remember and place ourselves at the time, today, and with what few monarchies remain today. It's more or less assumed that the monarch is this more or less subservient symbolic entity that plays a ceremonial role in the functioning of the country, doesn't really have much power, and is in any case entirely subservient to the elected body. Take, for example, the English or the British monarchy. The king does not have really any authority. There's debate about whether he could exercise authority, and he does have it. He just doesn't exercise it. In practice, he really doesn't have any authority, and he abides by Parliament. That hasn't always been the case in English history, as we all know. But at this time, that concept was still maturing. It was still coming into being, and there were still vociferous opponents to the idea of a monarch being subjected to the will of a governing body, a parliamentary body. And some of the people who were the most adamantly against this philosophy, the most adamantly against the idea of the divine, or most adamantly in favor of the divine right of kings, as it's called, were his neighbor to the south, the Austrian king, and his neighbor to the east, the Russian emperor, the Austrian emperor and the Russian emperor. They were both adamantly opposed to this, and they would have seen the acceptance of this by the Kaiser as an affront to all things everything that they believed in. And so I think
also a betrayal, because basically Prussia had been a active member of the Holy Alliance with those other two nations and had been involved in actively suppressing any kind of national or liberal rumblings throughout Europe since 1815.
Right, exactly. Yes. And so what we have here is we have a situation where he has accepted an offer from the Frankfurt Parliament. And it's important to note, I can't remember if we discussed this in the pre-podcast or in the show, or maybe both, but the Frankfurt Parliament is not comprised of a bunch of imperially appointed electors, right? It is composed of lawyers, doctors, middle-class businessmen, aristocrats, things of this nature. This is a parliament that is, I'm not going to say it's entirely representative of the people, but it is at least nominally representing the will of the people. And so for him to accept this would be essentially to legitimize democratic institutions, to legitimize the democratic institution of the Frankfurt Parliament, instantaneously granting them power that they otherwise don't have. And in fact, in our timeline, when he rejects the offer, the Frankfurt Parliament really doesn't do much at all, and it pretty much dissolves shortly thereafter. So I think that's the biggest thing. And how does Russia, particularly, because let's be honest, Nicholas I, the Tsar of Russia, is really the enforcer, so to speak, of these conservative divine right of kings ideology. In fact, he intervenes in Hungary to quell rebellions there. He's more than happy to intervene on behalf of other beleaguered European monarchs who have their authority threatened. He's more than happy to intervene with them because, one, he regards the Russian army as the jewel of the state, and two, he regards any attempts at liberalization, any attempts at democratization to be direct threats to his crown. So he's more than happy to intervene. And I think it's very possible, and I would like to hear your guys' opinion as well, that Nicholas I basically jumps in and says, not happening. We're going to invade, we're going to intervene, and we're going to put an end to this liberalization that we are utterly opposed to.
Just one thing I want to put a fine point on.
Yes.
Russia does send troops into what is today Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
When Russia does, it is still under the Austrian Empire. And at this point, it is the Austrian Empire. It isn't what all of us learned in World War I class.
It doesn't become the Frankenstein of the Austro-Hungarian
Did I say
Empire.
Austro-Hungarian Empire? Sorry.
You
no,
didn't,
you just said
you did
Hungary.
not. You just said Hungary.
Okay.
And we wanted to put a little bit of a fine point on that. It's
right.
not yet what has developed into World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But also, Chris, you mentioned in the pre-podcast as well, the Russian army ostensibly invades, but it was kind of an open door, right? It was basically like, hey, you guys can come on in. Oh no, the Russians are invading. Whatever shall we do? Sort of a mentality.
Because they weren't. That's kind of why I pointed out that the Hungarians weren't on side yet.
Yeah.
It was still the Austrians. It was still the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs could not control could not control Hungary, and therefore invited in the Russians to help them control Hungary.
Right.
20 years later is when they still can't control Hungary. And rather than inviting in the Russians, that's when they kind of invite the Hungarians to form the dual monarchy, blah, blah, Austro-Hungarian Empire. But that is important, and that is a good point for what we thought was going to happen, which I agree with Kai that we would probably see some sort of Russian intervention in Germany. But to Evan's point, nobody wants them there. Nobody invited them. They're not. You have a fully constituted national government that is in opposition to this. And you got somewhere for the German people to unify behind this new Kaiser of theirs in resistance to the Russian invasion.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to bring up because I think a prospective Russian invasion, whether or not it actually materialized and whether there's going to be some sort of intervention. But I think the threat of Russian meddling and Russian invasion to quell what is viewed as a very liberal, progressive, this is the future. We're starting a new, the revolution essentially is successful in its main overall goal, which is write a constitution, have a representative body with a individual who is widely respected being installed as the leader of this newly constituted Germany. Now it's coming under attack. So I feel like a lot of individual German polities that would have probably been very resistant, such as Bavaria or Hanover, I think they would fall in line and they would be like, okay, well, maybe we're not super in favor of this whole experimentation, but we're certainly not in favor of having us all speak Russian. So we'll get in line. We'll fall in line behind this. I would be interested to see if, we have an example of like the Austrians inviting the Russians into Hungary. do we think that maybe the Austrians would be so upset by this development that they would join Russia?
I don't think they've got the capacity to.
That's what I was leaning towards. Yeah.
I mean,
I
I
don't
think
think
if you have kind of the example of Germans taking up arms to kind of create their own nation, even if Austria happened to have a couple of spare divisions, they're not going to let them out of Vienna because they're afraid
yeah.
of this happening to them too.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, perhaps there would be some sort of, um, behind the scenes support or just staying neutral, staying out of it. But I don't think they're not going to be happy by this development for sure. And so, but the other thing that I was referencing towards the start of the podcast of, what's most likely versus what we are going to be toying with here is, and maybe I'm kind of doing what Evan normally does in the midst of a podcast, which is bringing up something a little bit too soon, and we have to develop other planks of that first. But I'll keep going with that streak, and that is, where does Bismarck land in the midst of all of this and what ultimately ends up happening with him? Because he is not someone who is going to just go away quietly into the night. That's not the kind of guy he is. He's very reactionary. I mean, he's literally good old blood and iron. Like that he has a very famous quote, which I also have on my document. The great questions of our day will not be solved by speeches and majority of resolutions. That was the error of 1848 and 1849, but instead by blood and iron. So I think this is probably a good time, though, to bring up the immediate what happens with Bismarck in the midst of this looming threat. And then we have some fun thoughts about what ultimately ends up happening with him. But yeah, in the midst of an impending, Russian intervention / invasion, what does happen with Bismarck in the midst of all this? Because the more likely timeline that we started sketching out was essentially this just becomes somewhat of a backdoor for Bismarck to still ultimately end up gaining, a lot of prominence, even though he's not going to gain outright control. Our original timeline idea was Frederick basically receives the crown and then pulls a Napoleon III. He ends up kind of becoming the emperor through a little bit of a more prolonged process. But we're going to have him stay democratic, and we're going to have Germany stay democratic. So, and either of you two want to talk about what happens with Bismarck and then start kicking us down the timeline of a brewing Russian conflict?
Well, Otto von Bismarck was a adamant divine right of kings believer. He was strictly militaristic. He was very much against any attempts at democratization or liberalism. He was a firm believer in iron and blood, as Evan said, and the king is divinely appointed. No electoral body can grant a king the right to rule. Only God can do that. And so he would be, as he was, absolutely opposed to the idea of accepting the Frankfurt Parliament's proposition to make I always forget his name. I always
Frederick.
It's Frederick Wilhelm
Wilhelm.
IV.
Yeah.
The fourth, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Frederick Wilhelm IV. He would be opposed to Frederick Wilhelm IV accepting this. He was opposed to it, and he would continue to be opposed to it, even if the king accepted it, because he would see it as a fundamental threat to the legitimacy and the future of the German Empire that he was so desperate to bring into fruition, and its health and its vitality. He would see all of that being threatened by a monarch undergirded solely by an elected body and not by the divine right of kings. So if Frederick Wilhelm was to accept this, I think that would immediately create a rift between the two. Basically, it would turn Bismarck against Frederick Wilhelm IV, and it would create a rift between those two that I think would cause Otto von Bismarck to lose a lot of the influence and the authority that he is granted as a result of.
I mean,
Well, they basically just rug pulled him. Like, that's
Right,
basically
right,
what the
yes.
Frankfurt Parliament just did. So whatever, I mean, he's going to be off, crying and complaining and screaming off in Prussia, but he's not the head honcho. Like, the authority structure has just been completely changed on him. So in essence, I think he gets sidelined.
Right.
So two
Yes.
things. One, he exists because of his relationship with the Kaiser.
Yes.
At this point, Frederick Wilhelm IV, Frederick Wilhelm's son, Wilhelm I, even more so because by that point, he's really growing into the role later on. The one thing I want to say is this. I agree that Bismarck lands on the divine right of kings side of the liberalism / monarchy debate. But I do think that he lands on the German side of the national debate. And just like he got Hanover and Baden and Bavaria and every other German state to join Prussia, I think when you have Cossacks advancing across Poland, he is going to put aside whatever he feels and will take part on the German side.
100%. No, I would
I
totally
don't
agree.
think that that's the case that Otto von Bismarck would be disloyal to. I think it would be more so that Frederick Wilhelm IV would because by making the decision that he does in our alternate timeline of accepting the proposition from the Frankfurt Parliament, he is inherently disregarding the advice of Otto von Bismarck. And so I think that it's more so a case of the Kaiser's ear would be whispered to by different forces, not that Otto von Bismarck would be so upset that he would not wish to whisper it to his ear anymore. Does that distinction make sense?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And I agree with it. Where I'm going is this. Bismarck, like many Prussian aristocrats, I guess I kind of gave it away right there, is from Prussia. And the old Prussian heartland is today northern Poland, right along the Baltic. And I think that's important to think about because there were times in our timeline when he had a falling out with the Kaiser and he went back to his Junkers family farm in basically Prussia. That is where the Russians are coming through. If Nicholas sends an intervention force, that's where they're going. And I think that might be, you're right. A lot of Bismarck in our timeline comes from his role of having the Kaiser's ear. If he doesn't have the Kaiser's ear, though, I think the role of going back and organizing resistance to the Russians.
Yes. I think he becomes
very realistic.
Yeah, 100%. I think he definitely becomes much more of the leaning into the Prussian nobility and the militaristic side. Those are really his giftings. And his own political beliefs and political views have kind of lost the moment, lost the debate at this point. But I don't think that Frederick would go as far as to be like, okay, I've chosen to listen to these people instead of you, so I'm not going to have you do anything. I still think that Bismarck is going to be an important figure, especially in military circles and in the defense of what is now Eastern Germany. Still the region is referred to as Prussia at this point, but he'll be important. And we'll get back to him eventually because we have some very interesting ideas for what will ultimately end up happening with him. But I kind of want to start moving this along to talk about what this conflict would look like and who would ultimately end up winning and all those sorts of things. Because, Chris, you did mention in the pre-podcast about how essentially this conflict would kind of supplant what turned into the Crimean War in our timeline, if I understand what you were saying correctly.
Yes, I think I agree that basically, Kai's idea, Nicholas is not going to let this fly. He is going to send troops into the German Empire, but the fact that they're not invited in, the fact that Frederick Wilhelm opposes this and basically moves westward to keep up the resistance, given the importance of the resistance to Napoleon, kind of Battle of Nations, Leipzig, to the kind of foundational conception of what it means to be German. I do believe that, man, yeah, Nicholas can try. He's not going to get very far. I think one of the other things is that in our timeline, you did hint at the Crimean War. Basically, as soon as he gets done settling Hungary's hash, Nicholas II starts looking at the Ottoman. It's kind of an eternal thing that Russia's always trying to do. If he's involved in Germany, he's not doing that because he's distracted. But two powers most of us know that did step in to try and stop Russian expansion in 1853 were France and Great Britain. I'm going to talk about France. Evan, you've got some British connections to talk about in a second.
Yes.
France at this point is run by Napoleon III. He's basically solidified his hold. He is now Emperor Napoleon III. If he is going to intervene on the other side of Europe to protect the Ottoman Empire, you can bet that he is going to intervene to stop the Russians from being on the Rhine. There's nothing he wants. That is completely unacceptable to him. So I think he's going to get involved. And then, Evan, do you want to talk about the other Crimean power?
Yeah, exactly. And so powers that, especially in our timeline, have not really, in Europe, their interests have been very dissimilar and have not gotten along, is the British monarchy and Russia. And what is quite interesting, a wrinkle that sometimes we forget when we talk about these sort of alternate history subjects, is the fact of who is on the throne at this given point in Great Britain, and that is Queen Victoria. But most importantly, who is she married to? She is married to Prince Albert, who is of what house? The House of Saxe-Coburg, which, pull out a map, Google it, they're Germans. So we essentially have a German leading with Queen Victoria. So the historical and, ethnic, cultural, all those ties are going to be, with a Russia knocking on Germany's door, that's going to compel Britain to actually join the war on the side of Prussia/Germany.
I think one important thing to think about is Britain's universal policy is they do not want to ever see any one country control the continent. That is why so often they found themselves in conflict with the French, because most of the time during that period, the French were the ones most likely to try and take over the continent. Maybe the Spanish, kind of Habsburgs, Charles V period. At this point, that's the Russians most likely to violently take over Europe. Oh, and by the way, here's the other thing that I think is the biggest issue, kind of one of the biggest changes, and we'll get to this a little bit later. Germany wasn't united by force.
Yeah.
Germany has never invaded any of its neighbors. And so if you're Britain, you do not see Germany at all as a power that you have to worry about taking over Europe.
Yeah, you're not concerned with them. You're concerned with the Russians because they're the ones who are invading a newly constituted nation that was not unified by force. It was unified by democratic election.
I think we also should think about the nature of the British Parliament and the British and Britain as well, is that Britain is going to be having a lot of, I should say, Parliament is going to be having a lot of sympathetic feelings for a nation that has just risen, that essentially elected its monarch in a fashion similar to what the English had done during the English Civil War and what basically all of English history has been, which is a battle between Parliament and the king.
Yeah.
And in this scenario, we have a situation coming in Central Europe where Parliament has, I put this in quotes, won, in that they have persuaded the emperor to essentially side with them over militaristic authoritarian forces. Parliament is going to be very interested in that. I don't know how much the Queen is going to be persuaded by it or interested in it, but Parliament for sure is going to be very interested in this development, and they're going to see Russian aggression for what it is, essentially an invasion of a sovereign state that made its own decisions and that was not invaded by force or had some sort of terms forced upon it. So I think that that's going to play a big role in Britain's perception of the situation. But the second thing is that so much of the tensions that will come into being as a result of a unified Germany that is Bismarck's brainchild is the fact that it is such a highly militarized, highly authoritarian, highly top-down centralized entity that is power hungry, expansionist,
Seeks to unify all those German-speaking areas, including in Czechia, and they're not big fans of that.
exactly. And so that is the reason, or that is a big reason why conflicts like World War I and World War II come into being, is because Germany has this history. I'm not going to say a long history, but it has a decently sized history of being an expansionist authoritarian power bullying its neighbors. But that hasn't happened yet. And the fact that it's coming about in a different way through an elected, or not elected, but a representative parliament is a very interesting idea that completely undercuts the idea of Germany as this autarkic society. And it opens the door for an earlier normalization of relationships between France, Britain, and Germany, in my opinion.
Well, and I mean, this is something that in our timeline wouldn't happen until after 2 world wars.
Precisely.
So we're essentially laying the groundwork for, because Russia, to me, a lot of what Russian history can be boiled down to is 2 main problems. They're not accepted to the cool kids party. They're not really necessarily seen as fully European, and they don't like that. And warm water ports. Those are really the 2 major things with all the big expansion, how long and complicated and interesting Russian history is. Those are 2 of the biggest issues that really are for the Russian Empire all throughout its history. And so, yeah, what I think is interesting about this alternate timeline is we have, I think, an even starker dividing line between what it means to be Russian and what it means to be, being seen as this aggressing outside power. And like you brilliantly mentioned, Kai, Britain doesn't want any one country or people group or power center to take and transform Europe into what would be referred to in World War II as Fortress Europe under Austrian painter. So I think it would be interesting, and I'm just going to throw this out and then kind of lead us back to what happens with the war ultimately in the immediate sense. But I'm just curious to see just how much more belligerent this would make Russia in the long term compared to like our modern history. Like, they became the USSR, Soviet Union. Now they're the Russian Federation, but they got this whole war going on in Ukraine for a lot of very long, complicated, interesting historical reasons. Well, if we have a Russia that is even, more on the outs, much more seen as the aggressor, and we have essentially Western Europe unifying to expel them, to kick them out. I'm also going to just throw this in here as well as a little sticky note, and I don't know if I'll go back to this later, if it's worth expanding beyond this point, but Austria, another thing that I think is interesting to think about Austria is they're currently, even in our timeline, having to fight some brewing revolutions with the Italians because, 1848, very important year in Europe, a lot of revolutions happening. Italy is starting to make some Italian unification noises. And so I'm just going to say, I think Italy unifies faster in this alternate timeline. And all of this is to say, I'm going to tie this all together, is a Russia that is, in our timeline, it's basically culturally dominated by what I would call the European side of Russia, just mainly due to it, the history, the culture, the fact that there's way more people on the western side of the Ural Mountains versus the Asian side of Russia. I'm just going to say one of the biggest impacts of this timeline that we're developing is that Russia is seen as even less of a European power and is seen as much more of its own separate entity. I think that makes them even more openly belligerent and hostile of the force moving down the timeline. That, of course, assumes that they're even going to be a force to deal with, because I'm just going to say, spoiler alert, I don't think this excursion into Germany is going to go well for them at all.
Well,
Crimean
War didn't go well for them.
Sorry, what was that?
The Crimean War didn't go well.
Yeah, the Crimean War didn't go very well for them.
Russia has not had a very successful history with aggressive invasions. We'll just put it at that.
Yeah, I mean,
let alone an invasion of a sovereign nation that is I think it's thousands of miles away from Moscow.
Well, two things. One, they can be as belligerent as they want. If they can't do anything, they don't matter. Just to kind of, and this is something we were thinking about previously, to kind of piggyback a little bit on one of the things Kai said. Yeah, Germany's a couple thousand miles from Russia, across country filled with people that don't consider themselves Russians and don't want anything to do with the Russians. And I'm not just talking about the Germans.
But they're not Germans either.
I'm talking about Poland.
Right.
And I think it's very realistic to kind of see, especially as like historically kind of trying to pick up, for the lack of a better word, Napoleon's eagle, as Napoleon III is. The Polish kingdom that he reconstituted was a big part of the invasion of Russia. There's kind of always, you always have like Polish nationalists hanging out in Paris.
Well, and you have European powers that are more than happy to provide the Poles with a buffer state between the Russian Bear and the rest of the European continent.
Exactly. So I think that's what winds up happening is there is kind of a entity called Congress Poland after 1815, which is in personal union with the Tsar. What that means is the Tsar is in charge of both, but administratively they're two separate places. That no longer exists after this. The settlement that happens here is that Russia gives up Poland, and Poland is an independent country. It is important, I think, to note that in our timeline, basically the whooping they got in the Crimean War is what triggered Russia, the Tsar, to realize that I need to modernize, I need to in serfdom all of this. I think he's going to, and I think it's really interesting to think about if national, like, if basically what we're talking about, nationalism has won. Nationalism was the force. Germany is united. Poland is in existence. I do want to come back and think about Austria in a second.
Mm-hmm.
And then Russia in serfdom. I think you've got a really interesting question with Ukraine, with
Oh yeah.
the Baltics, with Finland.
Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth 2.0. You heard it here first.
I mean, I will say this. They were the last power to successfully actually take Moscow. Make as many jokes as you want about charging tanks on horseback. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the last foreign power to actually to occupy and hold Moscow.
Yeah. There you go. So
talk about Austria, though. I think that was really interesting. The idea that, and I think this may happen where Austria lines up with Russia. One, because they kind of owe Russia a lot, and I think that they get involved. Napoleon III was a big reason why Italian unification happened. So I think he gets involved. You have the opening of an Italian front.
Yep.
Northern Italy gets unified. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about what happens to Austria, to the Austrian Empire. I mean, you've had a significant Hungarian movement. You've got a Germany that, to some extent, has a little bit of a claim on traditional Austria. Does the Habsburg Empire survive this?
I think it
my
makes
knee jerk is to say no. But sorry, go ahead, Kai.
I was just gonna say I agree with that, but I think it also would make the union between Austria and Hungary that's to come that much more tenuous.
Well,
I don't know if that happens.
Yeah,
that's what I'm sitting here thinking.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it doesn't even happen to begin with.
I mean, I'm thinking you've got kind of Hungary is just recognized as an independent state. By the way, there were Austrian representatives at the Frankfurt Parliament already. I think if Austria loses Hungary and Italy and basically its Balkan possessions, I mean, it was written into Versailles that Austria would not be allowed to join Germany.
Right.
They had to explicitly say that because if they don't, well, Austria would rather be a little fish in a very big pond than a big fish in like a strangling plastic bag, because that's kind of what Austria is going to become if they lose Hungary.
Yeah, no, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking that they really don't have the power to project anything that they would like to have happen, especially in light of losing a lot of very, key territories. And so I think they're going to still exist, but I don't know how to necessarily phrase it. They'll kind of almost be somewhat of a rather large rump state, I would assume at this point. Because, I don't think Germany has really any interest in actually taking them over. But they're also certainly going to be completely fine with just letting the inbreeders, rule in Vienna. And it's like, what are you going to do about it? You can't do anything to resist what we want to do. We just whooped the Russians. So your natural allies, who are now also out of Hungary, and Hungary is also kind of a, it exists sort of buffer rump state itself. I think they just kind of end up still existing, but they are almost kind of reduced to a non-entity or a non-factor after this point.
Certainly, they won't be in the position that they will be in, that they are in 1914.
Precisely. And
Not going to
that is,
happen.
I think that is what is ultimately, I think, the biggest shoe that is going to drop as a result of this alternate timeline is almost, I'm going to say almost, because I think it's too broad of an assertion to say that there would be none of these factors that would exist. But almost all of the factors which precipitated the Great War are not going to be in existence in this alternate timeline. And that, of course, ultimately achieves our ultimate end goal, which we always like to try and do when we talk about this period of history, which is preventing World War II.
I don't agree.
All right, Chris.
I think you've got Napoleon III in power. He is expansionist. And so you may not see it in anything that looks similar to us. But for example, he had a bunch of troops in Mexico supporting Maximilian in 1862, 63 period, because the United States was a little busy. He had to pull all of those troops out of Mexico because he began to be worried about Prussia and Bismarck's unifying of Germany. If he doesn't have to do that, those French troops are going to stay in Mexico supporting Maximilian. The United States is going to settle with the Confederacy's hash. And then what? In our timeline, the withdrawal of the French troops and the United States basically opening up a whole bunch of army surplus to Benito Juarez was enough to solve that situation. It may not be. So you might have France being involved against the United States. You also have a very expansionist power in general. And to kind of harken back to our episode last week about the Fashoda incident, you can easily see Napoleon III. Napoleon III isn't known for being crazy, primarily because of Wilhelm II. That's one of the reasons he's not like looked at as a nutto. He is a nutto, and he's going to start some stuff elsewhere. So I'm not willing to say that the European powers are done fighting.
Yeah,
But it would be a very different conflict. And with regards to Austria-Hungary, they would be much less of an entity than they were.
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
I agree with that.
I think that does provide a lot of good color as we kind of start closing out this episode of the battle lines would be different. They would be drawn differently. There would probably, well, not probably, there absolutely would eventually be some other conflict on the European continent, but it would be between different powers. There would be different causes of it. And by the time we would get to, further down the line to 1914, it would almost be, impossible to say on an alternate history, theory crafting perspective, what the spark that blows up the powder keg would be. Would it even be in 1914? Would it be sooner? Would it be later? I think it'd be sooner, personally.
We're looking at a World War II in 1914. I think we might.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to say. Is I think we would have a bigger conflict, a Great War, World War I-ish style conflict happening sooner, and then we might have a second greater conflict in World War II, or in the 1914, 1920s time frame. That certainly is very much on the table for sure. All right. Well, I think that's probably about all that I had on the subject. Do you two gents have anything else that you might want to throw in here?
I've got one.
All right, let's hear it.
Really
Brace for impact.
Yeah.
If North Dakota is a state, its capital is not named Bismarck.
Is not named Bismarck.
I think if you and that leads to something much bigger just to kind of think about, which is if you look at the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, a lot of those settlers were Germans from non-Prussian states escaping the militarism of Prussia. And so if you don't have that impetus pushing so many of them to the United States, what does that do for settling that area? What does that do for American politics? What does that do for so many of the leaders of kind of the progressive era? Were these Germans that came over during this period? If they don't, what does that do?
That's actually a huge
That's a really interesting
ripple
proposition.
effect. Yeah.
And we always find a way to bring it back to the US of A.
Oh, of
You know what?
course.
And
I'm
let's
actually
be
kind of
real.
impressed we didn't mention the United States as much as we usually do. We kind of slid it in more towards the end here. But no, that's a very
But it is a
fascinating
very
ripple effect.
interesting proposition because like those states are essentially German settlements. I mean, I've been to Minnesota, and I've been to the Dakotas, and there's a lot of German culture and German influence there, which, I mean, German Americans are the single largest ethnic group in the United States, more so than even English Americans and Scottish Americans. German Americans are number one. And so that would have
by the way,
profound cultural implications.
part of that was kind of going back to the settlement of Pennsylvania and other periods, and there still would be some,
Right.
but
Yeah,
Right.
right.
There
There
would
would
be
be
some,
some, but it
absolutely.
wouldn't be as much of a culturally significant as it ended up becoming.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, when you were saying that, Chris, I think that would be interesting to kind of think about, would there be another European group that would possibly take their place as the ones, coming over here, fleeing an autocracy? And I don't know, maybe that would mean the French would end up becoming that. Maybe more Russians would come over. I don't know. I was
would
thinking about
say-
Alaska, right? I was thinking about
Mhm.
what would happen to Alaska as a possibility. I think it'd probably be very similar. I think especially if you have a weakened Russia, I mean, honestly, maybe even the United States doesn't have to cut a check. Maybe they just kind of assume it. Maybe Canada takes it first. Who knows?
Counter argument is that it ends up being very similar in that instead of fleeing Prussian aggression, they're fleeing the Russo-German war.
Yeah.
That we
Yeah.
just the whole
Mhm.
episode was about. Yeah.
Right. That could definitely still be a possibility. But
the thing is, though, if it is that, I understand that. That's a different kind of German coming.
yes.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And having, an aristocratic, militaristic minded set of German folks coming over, as opposed to ones who would be more predisposed to progressivism, that would be really interesting to see how that would trickle down into American politics. The one last thing that I'm going to throw in here at the very end is I just wanted to throw this more crackpot idea that I had thought about as a possibility and contemplated briefly, but we swiftly left it on the cutting floor in the pre-podcast discussion. And that was, I had thought about and contemplated a timeline where Bismarck actually goes full Bismarckian. He goes full, blood and steel or blood and iron, and decides, I've had enough with King Frederick. I'm going to actually invade Frankfurt. And is that likely at all? No. Especially because at this point, Bismarck is not the same figure that he was to be able to launch wars in the 1860s. But I just wanted to say that was something that I had bandied about in my head as a possibility. I even asked AI to draw up a invasion timeline and everything. The idea was my brainchild. It was born in my brain, just to be clear. I did not ask AI for this. All I wanted to do was just to see a year-by-year breakdown of what a Bismarck Frankfurt invasion would look like. And I just think it was kind of fun to contemplate, but very much one of those less likely crackpot alternate history concepts. Kai, do you have anything else you want to throw in here?
No, I think I'm good. I think this was a good digestion of a very complex geopolitical situation.
Indeed. And you know what? I just realized our panel is actually probably a very solid representation of the parties that are involved in this conflict. We have me as, half Welsh, half German. We have Chris, who is Italian. And then we have you, Kai, who are Scottish and German, if I remember correctly. Right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, mostly
I do
Scottish,
feel
English, German.
Yeah.
I am half German. Kind
Oh, okay. Interesting.
But my German half would actually be German instead of considered from other countries because of Austrian painters.
Yes, there we go. Well, so we all, in terms of our own personal family histories and backgrounds, we have a lot of stake and say in this matter. All right, guys. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in and listening to us talk about complex geopolitical issues of the 1840s, 1850s in Central Europe. If you guys enjoyed this episode, sound off about it in our Discord, which is where we have a small but growing and thriving little community. We always appreciate your guys' feedback and suggestions. And as we always like to end off these episodes, if we happen to stumble across a fork in Frankfurt, what do you think we should do with it?
Pierce the Frank.
I say drive as fast as you can, because as we all grew up hearing as kids, there are no speed limits on the Autobahn.
I like that a lot. I didn't think that's where you were going. I figured that we were going to say something about constitute a parliament and elect it the monarch of Germany. But
I was
usually
just
like to do.
My brain was too focused on trying to fit in a hot dog joke somewhere, because we talk so much about Frankfurt, and every time I hear the word Frankfurt, I think about hot dogs. So,
Well, true, and then don't get me started on Hamburg.
yes.
But anyway, for now, we also have food thrown in here as well, which is what we also like to do here on A Fork in Time. But how we usually end this is, if we stumble across a fork in time, we think you should take it. Thanks so much for tuning in. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.